What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. We are going to be going over some fire protection for the 767. I had a request come in through email asking me to go a little bit more into fire detection systems, so I figured I would just cover the whole thing, hopefully quickly. We'll see how the video goes. But you guys know me, I like to talk and I like to explain stuff, so we'll see how it goes. Right now, I've got about 11 slides on a PowerPoint, which I know everybody's going to love to hear, but really it's the easiest way for me to go through this information and show you the controls and all that kind of stuff. Explain's good for a lot of stuff, and I can explain a lot of stuff in it, but boy, sometimes PowerPoint, it's just better to get back to the basic of it, right? So, fire protection systems, we're going to talk a little bit about engines, and a little bit about cargo, and a little bit about everything that has to do with fire. What I'm going to talk about, though, is primarily based on me having a background in cargo aircraft. So all of the airplanes that I teach or have taught are cargo. They're all converted either through Boeing or IAI converted or whatever. They're all cargo aircraft. So that doesn't mean that it's not applicable to 767s that are flown for passengers. It absolutely is. But I'll talk about differences as we go through it. Okay. Now, depending on how you look at things and depending on how you judge things, the first one that we're going to talk about may be the most important. But I'll let you make that determination for yourself. So, in this particular case, we're talking about the engines, right? The engines being on fire, which everybody knows we only got two of them. That's a big deal. I don't want my engines to catch on fire. And that's understandable. But what's the difference between an engine overheat and an engine fire? Anybody? No? Okay. So, engine fire happens in the engine, or around the main core of the engine, right? Where the overheats occur towards the top, closer to the pylon. And that's an important distinction to make, and I'll talk a little bit more about the differences here in just a sec. So, looking at our panel, this is found on the center aisle stand. We've got engine overheats, bottle discharges, and our fire lights on our fire handles. Now, depending on your particular airline, it will depend on what they call these. Some of them call fire handles, some of them call fire switches. Whatever you want to call them, whatever your company calls them, fine. You call it what it says in your book. I'm going to use fire switches for everything because that's what I'm used to, and that's why I teach. So, when we look at this, the left and right engines have overheat protection on them. They also have fire detection and protection, right? So technically overheat doesn't really have a protection system. The fire is the one that has the protection system. Everything just has a detection system, okay? So we understand the difference, right? Detection tells me I'm on fire. Protection lets me put out the fire. So it's an important distinction to make. Now, going along with that, how do we know that we're either on fire or that we're overheated? So the engines have what's called a dual loop system on them. Technically, there are two loop systems on the engine. Now, when I say that, one is for overheat, one is for fire. Okay, so two loops. So I got four loops. One does not detect the other. So fire doesn't detect overheat, overheat doesn't detect fire. Make sense? Okay. So on the engine, basically if you open up the panels on the side of the engine, you're going to see a very thin, what looks like a thin wire. There'll be two of them that run around all of the components inside that assembly on the engine on the inside of the cowling. That's your fire detectors. That's your dual loop system for the fire detectors. Now, how do they work? Great question. because I can give you a little bit. I can't give you specific numbers because I don't have specific numbers. I'm not an A&P. I don't have an A&P, and I don't really want an A&P. Kinda. I kinda do, but I kinda don't. But what they are is they're gas-filled tubes, and the change in temperature changes the pressure inside those tubes, which is kind of cool, right? They're gas filled tubes. As they heat up, that pressure changes, and that pressure sense, or that differential pressure that's sensed in there, is what detects the fire and says, hey, it's really hot in here. The pressure's changing. I'm on fire. Simple enough. But there's two loops. Why do I have two loops? I mean, everything else is in duplicate or triplicate, right? I've got 3 hydraulic systems. I've got 2 or 3 electrical systems, depending on how you look at it, and we can argue that all day, but that's a different video. But yeah, I mean, it's maybe it's just a backup, right? It's just a backup. One fails, I got another one. No. So for there to be a fire, and for there to be an actual fire indication, both loops have to detect the fire. Because let's think about it. If the engine's on fire and the loops are basically this far apart from each other, they should both detect the fire. If I get a faulty one that gives me a false indication of a fire, I don't want it setting off the alarm without double checking with the second one. Does that make sense? I hope so. It's late. I don't know. It's 10:30. I'm doing this because I want to get this out so you guys can see it. So if that didn't make sense, please leave me a comment, send me a message. I'll try and explain it a little bit more clear. But really, if we think about it, I shouldn't have an indication unless both of them sense it. Okay? So we got that out of the way. If for some reason one of those two loops does fail, I have a way for it to recycle itself, and it will turn into a single loop system. Therefore, the one loop that does work will be my detector at that point. But that's only in the case of a failure. With no failures, both loops have to detect it. All right, so that's the fire. The overheat. Overheat's very similar thing. It's a dual loop system. The only difference is it's closer to the pylon, kind of where your pneumatic, like your bleed air is, right? So if we have a pneumatic bleed air leak in the pylon or near the pylon, that's where your overheat's going to come from. So you're going to have a lot of hot air in that area. Again, it's a pressure change, it's a temperature differential, whatever, that causes that detection. But it's going to be more for a bleed air leak at the pylon than it is going to be a fire. Okay, if it's a fire, you're going to get a fire indication. If it's an overheat, you're going to get an overheat indication. Generally, the two do not cross. I never say never because the airplane's going to do what it wants. And I say that in all seriousness and joking, kind of in the same way. But there's a lot of things that are supposed to happen in theory that in practice you're not 100% sure. I can't 100% sure say that if I get a fire indication that I won't get an overheat detection, vice versa, right? So I'll just say that they're not supposed to. The way the system's made, the way the system is supposed to work, an overheat's not going to set off a fire. A fire shouldn't set off an overheat because guess what? If you're on fire, you're overheated. Just in case you were wondering. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, now let's talk about the bottle discharges. So now I have 2 bottle discharges, meaning I have 2 bottles. Okay, and when they ignite, or not ignite, but when they go off, when they discharge, they're discharging that fire extinguisher into the engine nacelle to try and put that fire out. Okay, but we have 2 bottles, and usually your memory items or QRH are going to tell you to pull the handle. Fire indication doesn't go out. You're going to rotate it to the stop, hold for 1 second. Then you wait 30 seconds. If the fire indication's still there, you rotate to the other stop, hold, and see if the fire goes out. And that blows both bottles. Hopefully, pulling the fire handle will do enough, or the fire switch will do enough, because what that does is that cuts off everything, right? Cuts off the fuel, cuts off hydraulics, cuts off everything to the engine. So hopefully it starves it to the point where it just kind of peters itself out anyway. But that may or may not be the case. So we have the extinguishers on there. Now the good thing is we have 2 extinguishers, so that's quite a bit. Bad news is once you use them both, they're done. You got nothing else for anything else. All right, so it's kind of a down and dirty on the engine fire loops. Remember, there's 2 fire detection loops. There is 2 fire overheat loops, or I should say engine overheat loops. So 2 engine overheats, 2 engine fires. Okay. Then this just kind of goes through and it explains a little bit more about what I was talking about, or what the names of the switches and lights are. So we got our engine overheat on the left and right side. We got our bottle discharges, or the engine bottle discharge lights, engine fire switches, and an engine fire warning light, which is the red light there on the switch itself. Now realize those switches, it won't be lit up until it's on fire, and then they light up. So there's that. And then we have our engine and APU fire override switch, which is there, number 5, this little thing right here. Now, what I don't have a good depiction of is what that actually does. So if we think about what happens out on the engine, it gets a fire indication. It sends a signal to the ICAS system saying, hey, there's a fire. Tell them there's a fire. Well, when it tells them there's a fire, what it also does is it sends an electrical signal to release this handle or switch to where you can pull straight up on it. Okay. So if we think about like my handles here, I've got this little claw thing that kind of holds it. And then when it gets the signal, the claw releases and I'm able to pull the handle. Okay. If for some reason I can't pull the handle, that button will release said latch. Okay. And when it releases that latch, now it allows me to pull the handle up, or the switch up. I know I said I would say switch, and I keep going back to handle. It is what it is. It's, again, the airplane I originally started on was a KC-135. They were T handles. They were fire handles. On the 7.6, they're fire switches. Anyway, and that button is true for both the left, right, and the APU. So left, right, engine, and the APU. Now, that can also be used if you're shutting the engine down for precautionary reasons. Something's messed up with it, whatever, and it doesn't get that signal to be able to pull the handle. You can push the button, pull the handle. It'll do the same thing, right? If you're using it for precautionary reasons. Not saying that you ever would, or that you ever should, or that you ever could. I'm just saying that that's what you could use it for, is if it doesn't get that signal, you can override, which is exactly what it's meant for. Now, fuel cutoff switches or fuel control switches. So fuel control switches to cut off, right? That's, engine fire checklist. So when we look at this, we've got little red lights that'll show up on the engine, on the fuel control switches. And when they light up, that tells you that engine's on fire. Boom, boom. All right, I'm cutting them off, or cutting it off, or whatever. Whatever you're doing, whether it's the left engine or the right engine, just try not to do both of them at the same time. That's probably a bad idea. That probably won't work out very well. So if you go cut off, that should be done. We're not delivering fuel to the engine anymore. We're not doing anything that that's going to cause more of a fire, more of an overheat condition. Now, with that being said, the lights come on when there's a fire indication, just like the other ones. And honestly, they're going to go out if there's no fire indicated. But at that point, it doesn't matter. The engine's cut off and it's done. Now, you do have a fire warning light. Fire warning light's a red light. It's going to be in front of the captain. It's going to be directly in front of them, next to the left side of the ICAS. This, I guess, would be kind of good to show you on the actual panel, but just believe me, it's directly in front of you. It's a big red fire light telling you that there is a fire indication. That fire indication is literally going to be for an engine, an APU, wheel well, or cargo fire being detected. Any of those will have the fire light come on. Now we get into the slightly more complicated ones. And the reason I say that is this is all going to depend on your airplane. If you're in a passenger carrying airplane, this should be what you have. If you're in a cargo airplane that was converted by IAI, the Israeli Aeronautic whatever, they have this panel in it. If you are on a Boeing converted freighter, a BCF, this panel doesn't exist. And when I say this panel, I mean this section right here. This section does not exist. And the reason is the 767s that were converted by Boeing to be cargo carrying airplanes do not have a fire suppression system on the lower decks. Okay, so let me say that again slowly so everybody understands what I'm talking about. The fire suppression on the lower decks of a Boeing converted freighter do not exist, which means that your entire aircraft is a Class E airplane. When it is Class E, the only way to fight a fire is to depressurize. Okay? That's it. There is no way, there is no fire extinguishing agent, there's no fire extinguishers, nothing. Okay? I just want to be clear on that. So, Boeing converted, this panel doesn't exist. Every other conversion, this exists. If you're in a passenger carrying airplane, this exists. Because this is the lower decks, the bottom part, the forward and aft on the bottom of the aircraft. All right? Now, somebody might ask, why isn't there a bulk? Why is there not a bulk compartment? Because there's a bulk cargo compartment. That's true, but the bulk and the aft are the same compartment. They're split by a net. So the net will let fire extinguishing agents go through. So they're the same compartment. They're just split not very well. Okay? And it has a different door. Now, with that being said, there are some slight differences when it comes to the cargo side of this, right? So we have our cargo fire arm switches, and I think I just hit this, didn't I? The cargo fire arm switches. That's these little switches right here, telling you that it's armed. Cool. If I have a fire in the forward compartment, I push that button, because what's going to happen? I'm going to get this forward light that's going to light up. I'm going to push this button. The armed light will then illuminate. And then when it illuminates, I come down here and I hit the discharge switch. Now, depending on your aircraft, you may see one button here. You may see two buttons here. If I see one button, that means the next couple steps happen automatically. If there's two buttons, that means I have to do the steps. All right. So, forward, red light comes on. Hit it for the armed. Cool. And now I hit the discharge. My fire suppression system is only going to send fire suppression to the forward cargo compartment. Now, the only place I can send my suppression is to the forward compartment. I can't send it to the aft. Okay? Because that's how the system works. It's armed forward. So that's all it's going to do. And the reason I say the next couple steps will happen automatically if I only have one switch here is because what happens, I have two fire bottles. When I push the button, the first bottle goes off at a high rate. It's a high rate discharge. It's a knockdown discharge is what it's supposed to be. So it is a bunch of suppression at one time quickly to try and knock down the flames and knock down the fire. And this is all halon, by the way, which is extremely not good for us as people. Because halon does a very, very good job of taking oxygen out of the air, out of the room, out of the area. And that's how it suffocates the fire. So we get that knockdown suppression from the halon in the beginning. Okay. 30 minutes later, or upon touchdown, meaning truck untilt, so truck's level, it blows the second bottle. Now, it's really going to be dependent on if you have an ETOPS airplane versus a non-ETOPS airplane, and that's another discussion, another video on what ETOPS is and what you can do with it on a 7.6, and that's a whole nother thing. So just real quick, out in the middle of nowhere in the ocean, that's ETOPS, right? I mean, I can explain it farther, but let's just assume that that's as much as we're going into right now. I need fire suppression for a long amount of time to be able to get to an airport to land in those situations. So in those situations, what actually ends up happening is that second bottle discharge is actually a metered discharge that is good for 195 minutes. Okay, so it's 3 hours and 15 minutes, roughly, of slow rate discharge into the area to keep the fire out or down so you can get the airplane to an adequate airport. Okay, and the reason that's important is because in ETOPS there is a possibility that you can be 180 minutes away from any type of airport or any type of adequate airport. Okay, and that's why I said it's a different video. We can talk about that later. So how does it know that it's on fire? Okay, so how does it know that I get my warning lights in the forward to the aft? Smoke detectors. It's all done by smoke detectors. Now, on the 7.6, it has 2 fans that actually pull the air through the detectors. Or, no, I'm sorry. On the 7.6, it's done by a Venturi. On a 7.5, it's got 2 blowers that pull the air through. So on the 7.6, your bleed air creates a Venturi that pulls the air through these little smoke detectors, and the moment smoke is detected, boom, you get a fire indication. And then you proceed by pushing the armed and then the discharge switch. Okay, so smoke detectors, that's how it does it. Discharge light tells me that my bottle's been discharged and that everything else is happening automatically. Now remember, I said if there were 2 switches there, if there were 2 buttons for the cargo bottle discharge, that I would have to do the next step, on my own, and that is the second discharge. So your QRH is all going to explain this in detail, but generally what you're going to do is you're going to hit the arm switch, then hit the discharge, and then 30 minutes later, or upon touchdown, you're going to push the second button. And then that does either your metered discharge or your second bottle discharge to make sure that the fire is down. And then obviously you want to make sure that you notify people on the ground that that's what you've done. That way when they open the cargo compartment, they're not like, oh my God, what is all this stuff that's just covered in fire suppressant and, halon and whatever else inside that compartment. You don't need or want any of that, right? And then obviously the discharge light to tell me that it's completely out, right? Now on the other side of this panel, now remember this is all here on your center aisle stand. On the right hand side there, we've got our APU. Now I've got APU bottle discharge, I've got an APU switch. That is a fire switch just like the engines. So it releases the same way and it lifts up the same way and it rotates the same way. The only difference is we're doing it with the APU, and in some, if not most cases, there's only one bottle that you can discharge, and that's the one fire bottle that's back there. Generally, and I'm going to say generally because I don't know how all the passenger carrying airplanes work. They probably all should have the automatic discharge for the APU if there's a fire indication on the ground, simply because they have passengers on board. The cargo side does not. The cargo side has an automatic shutdown, but not necessarily an automatic extinguishing. That is kind of an as installed thing that comes in, and those are 2 words that if you're in the cargo life and you bounce around from airline to airline, or you just have an airline that has kind of a mixed match of a fleet, as installed is going to be those 2 words you just hate to hear, because that just means something else is different, right? So anyway, if there's 2 bottles, then that's great. That means I can rotate the switch and hit a second bottle. If there's only 1 bottle, it doesn't matter which way I rotate this thing. It's going to blow the only bottle I have. And that's what this light's going to tell me. It's going to tell me that bottle is discharged. Now, if there were 2, there'd be 2 lights. And it would tell me APU bottle 1, APU bottle 2, and it'd be discharged that way. Again, on the switch, there's an APU light on the switch itself that will light up whenever the APU is on fire. Okay. So now, all right, I think we're going to go ahead and cut this here. I'm going to kind of interrupt me talking about this because the video is already almost at an hour long. So, yeah, we'll just cut this here. And I'll see you on the second video now, okay? All right, you guys have a good one.